Yeah, hi there. Is another time for another basic science lesson for JS2. Now, this time around, we'll be looking at the topic reproduction in plants. Now, we'll be looking at the introductory part of this lesson. Now, moving on, we'll be looking at the objective of today's lesson. Now, at the end of the lesson, learners should be able to define reproduction, stating the types. Describe the types of sexual and asexual reproduction. State the similarities between the two types of reproduction and distinguish between sexual and asexual reproduction. Now, moving ahead, we'll be starting with the subheading: what is reproduction? Reproduction is the biological process that produces new individual organisms from their parent or parents. Now, there are two types of reproduction. We have the sexual and asexual reproduction. As you can see in this diagram here, this is a diagrammatic representation of the two types of reproduction. This one here describes sexual reproduction, while this describes asexual reproduction. Now, moving on to sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction occurs when the sperm from the male parent fertilizes an egg from the female parent, producing an offspring that is genetically different from both parents. Now, as you can see in the diagram here, the male, especially for human beings, describing sexual reproduction in human beings, you can see that the male produces the sperm cell while the female produces the egg cell. Now, the sperm and the egg from the female fuses together to form what we call the zygote, and that zygote grows to the baby that we now have. Now, as you can see in sexual reproduction, both parents are required. Both male and the female parents are required to produce an offspring, and generally the offspring is genetically different from both parents. Now, we're going to be looking at the advantages and disadvantages of sexual reproduction. Now, the advantages of sexual reproduction is the increase in genetic variation. In other words, the parents are genetically different from their offspring. You see, because part of the offspring takes part of the trait from the male parent and also part of the trait from the female parents. Now, combining all this together, it gives a genetic variation. It's an advantage. Now, another advantage is that the offspring can adapt to new environments, because since all the offspring of a particular species, let's say man, since all men are not equal genetically, so there's a possibility or there's a chance that even when there are disease outbreaks or environmental conditions that are unfavorable, definitely the species will survive. And another advantage is that disease is less likely to affect the population because all are not the same. So when there is an outbreak of disease in a particular environment, everyone will not respond to it the same way. So the population is less likely to die out because of variation. Now, everything that has an advantage has a disadvantage. Now, these are the disadvantages of sexual reproduction. It takes time and energy to find a mate, since we require both parents to reproduce. It will take time and effort to find a suitable mate. And another disadvantage is the difficulty for isolated members of the species to reproduce. In other words, any member of the species will find it difficult to reproduce if he or she is unable to find a mate. So these are the advantages and disadvantages of sexual reproduction. Now, we'll be looking closely at asexual reproduction. What is it? Asexual reproduction is a mode of reproduction in which a new offspring is produced by a single parent. Now, this is one of the major differences between sexual and asexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction requires only a single parent. The new individuals produced are genetically and physically identical to each other. In other words, they are clones of their parents. And as you can see here, we have three examples that you have here. We have binary fission, carried out by an organism called planaria. We have budding in yeast or hydra and fragmentation in starfish. So we'll be looking at these various types of asexual reproduction one after the other. Now, as you can see here, these are the types of asexual reproduction. We have what we call binary fission, which occurs in bacteria. In this case, the parent splits into two identical offspring. So the parent splits into two identical offspring, as you see here in this particular bacteria. Another type is what we call budding. In budding, tiny buds develop on an organism's body and grow into another organism. As you can see here, this is an example of a hydra that carries out budding as the type of asexual reproduction that goes on. Now you can see that there's an outgrowth from the parent. You see, so that outgrowth separates from the parent and forms an adult offspring. So budding occurs in yeast, hydras, and sponges. We also have what we call spores. It's a type of asexual reproduction produced by one parent. They are light, so the wind carry them. Examples of organisms that carry out spore formation, we have fungi and ferns. They produce spores. So once these spores are carried by wind, as you can see examples here, once they are carried by wind and they land on a particular surface, they grow into an adult organism. Now we also have vegetative propagation. This occurs in plants. Here, new plants grow from parts of that plant, like stems, roots, or leaves. Examples, we have potato here. Potato is a particular plant that undergoes vegetative propagation. So we'll look at vegetative propagation very in detail in our next video. Now we are going to be going into advantages and disadvantages of asexual reproduction. Now, looking at the advantages, population can be increased rapidly when conditions are right. In other words, many offspring can be reproduced within a short period of time when conditions are right. And number two, asexual reproduction can exploit suitable environments very quickly. Number three, more time and energy efficient. In other words, it doesn't take too much time or energy to produce large number of offspring using asexual reproduction. And finally, reproduction is completed much faster than sexual reproduction. So you can get a large number of offspring very quickly in a sexual form of reproduction. Now, looking at the disadvantages, you have limited genetic variation in population. So in other words, offspring are genetically identical to their parents, which can be a bit problematic, especially when the conditions are not suitable. So that's the second disadvantage right here. The population is vulnerable to changes in condition and may only be suited for one habitat. In other words, they can't survive. The offspring that are produced through asexual reproduction cannot survive harsh conditions. They are only suited for one habitat. So once the condition in that habitat changes, there's a possibility that they will not survive, and that is not too good. And the last disadvantage that we have here is that disease is likely to affect the whole population, as there is no genetic variation. In other words, once there's an outbreak of disease, there's a possibility that the whole population will die off because they all look similar. They are genetically identical. So what happens to one will happen to every one of the offspring. So they are not likely to survive once there is a disease outbreak in the population. Now finally, we are going to be looking at the differences between sexual and asexual reproduction. As we have here, one difference is that it involves the fusion of male and female gametes. That is sexual reproduction. But in asexual reproduction, it does not involve the fusion of male and female gametes. In fact, we only require one parent only. Number two, sexual reproduction requires two different individuals, usually male and female, while asexual reproduction requires only one individual or parent. Number three, the individuals produced are not identical to their parents and show variation from each other and also from their parents. The individuals produced are identical to the parents and are called clones. 4. Most animals reproduce sexually. Both sexual and asexual modes of reproduction are found in plants. In a sexual mode of reproduction, this mode of reproduction is common in organisms having simple organizations such as algae and fungi. Number 5, sexual reproduction is a slow process, while asexual reproduction is a fast process. Now, sexual reproduction has evolutionary importance, while asexual reproduction doesn't. So, this brings us to the end of our lessons. Now, a quick look at the summary. Reproduction is a biological process whereby new individual organisms are produced from their parents. There are two types of reproduction: sexual and asexual mode of reproduction. Sexual reproduction occurs when the sperm from the male parent fertilizes an egg from the female parent, producing an offspring that is genetically different from both parents. Asexual reproduction is a mode of reproduction in which a new offspring is produced by a single parent. Now, before we go, I want you to pause this video and try to answer the question under the assessment section to see how much of the lesson that you have imbibed, and I'll see you again in the next class. Bye bye.